Hello YouTube and welcome to my channel. I wanted to do this video because the Republic is one of the foundational works in Western philosophy, and since I talk about philosophy a lot, I thought it would be helpful to do a series on the Republic as a kind of intro to the Western philosophical tradition. So before we get started, some introductory notes. Plato's Republic is a dialogue. It's written almost like a play with different characters speaking, with even some action between the characters. The main character is Socrates. Socrates was Plato's teacher. It might seem obvious, but just in case it's not understood, Plato is the author of the Republic, and he probably slipped in some of his own ideas into the mouth of Socrates, but he's not a character in the dialogue. The Republic is divided into 10 books. We're going to do book 1 today. Now, I called this a summary and analysis because I'm basically going to be presenting my thoughts on the book in a sequential manner along with a reading of the text. My recommendation for how to get the most out of this video is finding a copy of the Republic and following along with the Stephanus numbers in the bottom left of the screen. Stephanus numbers refers to the numbering system of the Republic that are standardized across all editions and copies. In the description, I've linked to a free online copy of the Republic that you can use. So let's begin. The first phrase of the Republic is just so important, and if you don't know how to look for it, you might miss it. Socrates begins by saying, "I went down yesterday to the Piraeus." Why is this so important? The phrase "went down" is used 81 times in the Bible. In the Old Testament, Abraham goes down to Egypt, and David goes down to the wilderness. In the New Testament, Jesus goes down to Capernaum. It's also used in the Quran. In Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra, and I'm sure in a variety of other works. There's an almost religious sense to the phrase "went down," and the rest of the dialogue will soon explain that. Think about the geography of the situation. Socrates and Glaucon had left Athens, the city of wisdom, to walk down to the Piraeus, the port city of Athens, in order to participate in the festival of a new goddess. Now, why is it important that Piraeus is the port city? Well, what happens at port cities? It's where trade occurs. So you don't just have Athenians or even Greeks at the Piraeus. It's full of different people of different cultures, of different religions, and different ideas, and it's essentially a marketplace. Whereas Athens is the eternal city of philosophy and is raised up high, the Piraeus is a city of sights, sounds, and people hawking their wares, physically lower than Athens. Socrates went down from the city of philosophy to the city of sights and sounds. This might seem like a minor point, but we will return to it when we talk about the analogy of the cave, so it's important to keep it in mind. On their way home from the festival, Polemarchus, apparently an acquaintance of Socrates, catches sight of them and sends a servant to ask Socrates to wait for him. Now think about that. Clearly, Socrates and Glaucon saw Polemarchus and decided to keep walking. Polemarchus sends a servant, and the servant literally grabs Socrates' cloak, saying, "Polemarchus wants you to wait." Imagine, if you will, that you and your friend are coming home late one night from partying, and you see someone you both know trying to get your attention, and you're like, let's keep walking. And this guy sends someone who grabs you to get you to stop and wait for him. What do you think would happen? Let's see how Socrates deals with this. Now Polemarchus walks up, and with him are Adeimantus, who's the brother of Glaucon, the guy hanging out with Socrates, and there's also Niceratus and a few others who are unnamed. So even if the few others are just 2, that means Polemarchus just rolled up on Socrates with at least 5 other people, preventing Socrates from leaving. And the first thing out of Polemarchus' mouth is, "Socrates, you look like you were leaving us." And Socrates just says, "Yeah, we were." Then Polemarchus says, "But there's more of us than there are of you, so you must prove yourself to be better or stay here." Polemarchus is literally saying, you need to fight us if you want to leave. While this is an encounter between friends and, there's some element of joking involved, there is a certain element of coercion involved as well. Socrates responds, "Well, could we persuade you to let us go?" And Polemarchus says, "Could you persuade us if we refuse to listen?" This should give you an idea of the role Polemarchus will play in the dialogue later. But here's where the conversation gets weird. Adeimantus says, "Didn't you hear there's going to be a torchlight race on horseback?" And Socrates is just like, "Really? How are they going to do it? Are they going to pass torches around on horseback?" And Polemarchus says, "Yes," and then lines up a whole schedule of activities for that night. Imagine you're leaving from a bar with your friend after a whole day of being out, and you're tired and you just want to go home, and then this group of 6 people just accosts you saying they aren't going to let you go, and by the way, there's going to be a torchlight horse race, a night festival, and then we're going to go out and meet more people, so be a good sport about it. And instead of saying, "I want to go home," you're just like, torchlight horse racing, I want to hear more about that. So Socrates and Glaucon go with them to Polemarchus's house, where they join a whole cast of new characters: Lysias and Euthydemus, who are Polemarchus's brothers, Thrasymachus, Charmantides, Cleitophon, and Cephalus, who is Polemarchus's father. Thrasymachus is going to be a major player later in the dialogue, but Cephalus is going to be the first one we get to meet, and it is here that the dialogue itself begins. We are told that Cephalus is wearing a chaplet because he had just finished his sacrifices to the gods. This becomes important later on. Cephalus greets Socrates saying, "Hey, good to see you. You don't come to visit as often as you should. You're always welcome." Cephalus also notes that he enjoys Socrates' presence because Cephalus enjoys good talk, especially now that as he's getting older, he doesn't find much delight in bodily pleasures. Socrates says that he too enjoys talking to Cephalus because talking to old people is like talking to a traveler who has already walked down roads we might ourselves have to walk down. So he asks Cephalus what being old is like. Like, imagine that conversation in today's language. "Hey Socrates, thanks for coming down to see me because I enjoy your conversation and I'm too old to walk up to the city to see you." And Socrates is just like, "Yes, you are old. What's it like being so old?" But Cephalus is a good sport about it, and he tells Socrates that while some old people complain about the lost joys of youth, Cephalus finds peace in his old age. He goes on to say that it isn't a person's age but their character that determines whether someone's life is pleasurable or not. He says, "For if men are temperate and cheerful, even old age is only moderately burdensome. But if the reverse, both old age and youth are hard for such dispositions." Socrates is impressed by this response and wants to hear more, so he's going to be kind of cheeky. He says, "Cephalus, most people think it's not because you're good-natured, but because you are rich that you are aging so comfortably." And Socrates has a point here because Cephalus is rich, and we'll soon hear why he is rich. But Cephalus essentially says, "Yeah, I agree it would be hard without money to enjoy being old, but money isn't enough, because if you have the wrong temperament, even being rich isn't enough to make you happy." Then Socrates asks a personal question. Did Cephalus inherit his wealth, or did he acquire it? Cephalus then says that his grandfather had been much wealthier than him, but his own father had wasted most of it, and he himself is happy as long as he leaves his own sons more than he himself had inherited. Socrates then makes an interesting point. He says that people who have inherited their wealth are easier to talk to than those who've earned it. The reason he gives is people who earn their wealth seem to treat money the same way a poet treats his own poems or a father treats his own sons. They seem unreasonably fond of it. This is interesting because Socrates seems to take the opposite view than what most modern people take. We tend to view inherited wealth with skepticism while we praise the self-made man. Socrates then asks Cephalus, "What is the benefit you've enjoyed from having a lot of money?" Cephalus says, "When you're young, you don't think about the consequences of your actions, but when you're old, you start thinking about death more, and about the rewards and punishments that are supposed to accompany one in the afterlife for the actions they've taken on earth. So as one gets older, one starts to have doubts and regrets about the way one has acted in life. So the advantage of having money is that you don't have to cheat people in order to get by, or be in debt to either men or gods." So Cephalus is essentially saying that the value of money is that in having it, you don't have to do evil things to acquire more of it, and you can pay back your debts. This is where Socrates lays his trap. He agrees with Cephalus and then says, "But Cephalus, would you say that the just and honorable thing is to always tell the truth and pay back debts? Or is it possible that in some circumstances it may be unjust to tell the truth and give back what one has received?" He gives the following famous hypothetical situation. If one took weapons from a friend who was in his right mind, and then the friend should go mad and demand them back, it would be wrong to give weapons back to the friend who is now insane. Cephalus agrees that it would be wrong to give the weapons back, and Socrates says, "So justice isn't just a matter of telling the truth and paying back debts." Now this may be just a hypothetical situation to further the discussion, but look at what happens next. Polemarchus, Cephalus' son, butts in and says Socrates is wrong. And Cephalus says and does something very interesting. "Very well," said Cephalus. "Indeed, I make over the whole argument to Polemarchus, for it is time for me to attend the sacrifices." "Well," said Socrates, "is not Polemarchus the heir of everything that is yours?" "Certainly," said he with a laugh, and at the same time he went out to the sacred rites. This is interesting for two reasons. First, hadn't Cephalus just said that he loves talking to Socrates and good discussion is a chief pleasure in his old age? Why is he leaving the discussion just as it's getting interesting? Second, hadn't he just come back from offering sacrifices? At the beginning of this discussion, it even said that he was still wearing his ceremonial sacrificing hat because he had just gotten back from sacrificing. So either he's lying that he needs to go sacrifice again and is just finding a convenient way out of the discussion, or he feels the need to make sacrifices to the gods multiple times in the same evening. So what could it have been about what Socrates said that caused Cephalus to react like this? Well, an interesting historical fact about Cephalus is that he was an arms dealer. He owned a shield-making factory that employed 120 slaves. He also was not an Athenian. He came from Thrace, a region that maintained a certain amount of power over Athens, because Athens would get their timber from which it built its warships from Thrace. So Socrates' question, hey, would it be good to give weapons to a madman? Wasn't just a hypothetical situation. When asked to a foreign arms dealer, it opened up a whole can of worms about his business dealings that Cephalus probably didn't want to bite into. Also, something important to remember is that the Republic was written by Plato in 380 BC, more than a decade after Socrates died, in 399 BC, and more importantly, after the dictatorship of the 30 Tyrants in 404 BC. The 30 Tyrants were a pro-Spartan oligarchy installed by Sparta in Athens after the defeat of Athens in the Peloponnesian War. Though they only ruled for 8 months, they killed 5% of the Athenian population, confiscated the property of the wealthy citizens, and exiled supporters of the democracy. Relevant to the debate is that the 30 Tyrants confiscated the estate of Cephalus and killed Polemarchus, Cephalus' son. So the arms dealer, who made his money by selling weapons, but then has his fortune seized and his son killed by tyrants who rule by force of weapons, is made to say that the great thing about money is that it gives him peace in his old age. This may be part of the reason why Cephalus decided to peace out of the discussion. Now that Cephalus has left, though, the second part of the dialogue takes place. The first part was characterized by this discussion of justice from the point of view of the wizened patriarch Cephalus. Cephalus and Socrates were discussing while the younger men listened to them. Now that the older Cephalus, representing the wisdom and authority of the elders, has left, Socrates is given the freedom to talk directly to the young men. Polemarchus inherits the argument from his father and reformulates his father's definition to say, justice is rendering each person his due. But in order to evade Socrates' hypothetical situation, he also says part of rendering someone their due is that friends owe it to friends to do them some good and no evil. Polemarchus' point is that it would not be right to return a borrowed weapon to a friend who has become insane, because that would be doing your friend evil. So Polemarchus has tried to protect his father's argument by qualifying it a little. But Socrates questions this definition. He says, but justice isn't between friends, it's also between enemies. So what is due to one's own enemies? Polemarchus replies, what it is proper to give one's enemy is evil. So now we have two definitions of justice. The first is Cephalus's, justice is telling the truth and paying back your debts. And the second one is Polemarchus's, justice is doing good to your friends and evil to your enemies, as is befitting to them. But Socrates pushes onwards in his examination. He takes Polemarchus' general definition and tries to apply it to specific circumstances. He asks, to what does the art of medicine render what is befitting to it? Polemarchus replies, the art that renders to bodies drugs, foods, and drinks. Socrates then asks about the culinary arts, and Polemarchus replies, seasoning to meats. And then Socrates asks if justice, like medicine or the culinary arts, is an art to tell us what is befitting to someone. And Polemarchus agrees. Socrates then asks, who then is the most able when they are ill to benefit friends and harm enemies in respect to disease and health? And Polemarchus replies, the physician. And who do navigators benefit with respect to the perils of the sea, pilots of ships? And the just man, in what work is he most competent at benefiting friends and harming enemies? Polemarchus replies, in making war and as an ally. Now Socrates starts laying his trap. He points out that if someone is not sick, then a physician is useless to them. I guess in 400 BC they didn't have regular checkups. But Polemarchus agrees. Similarly, a navigator is useless to someone not at sea. And then Socrates asks, so is the just man useless to someone not at war? Polemarchus of course disagrees and says that there is a use for the just man even in peacetime. So Socrates asks, what is the point of justice in times of peace? And Polemarchus replies, in engagements, dealings, partnerships, and associations. So Socrates asks him, is the just man a more useful partner in the placement of draughts or the draught player? Draughts is like an ancient Greek version of checkers. He also asks if in building a house, a just man is a better associate than a builder. Polemarchus obviously says no to both, and Socrates asks, for what kind of partnership is a just man a good partner? And Polemarchus says, money dealings. Ever the good son of an arms dealer, the only uses for justice he can think of are war and money. But Socrates presses on, asking, but if you're going to buy a horse, should your partner be the just man or a man who knows about horses? And if you're going to buy a ship, is it better to have a just man or a person who knows about ships? Polemarchus replies that the knowers of horses and ships are better respectively. So Socrates asks again, what kind of money dealings is the just man better for? Polemarchus says, when it is to be deposited and kept safe. So Socrates says, you mean when it is to be put to no use but to lie idle? Then it is when money is useless that the just man is useful in relation to it. You can see that Socrates has Polemarchus on the ropes at this point. He goes on to point out that it is not just the case for money, but other things as well. Whenever a given tool is being used, the specialist of that tool is more useful. But when the tool has to be stored and kept safe, then the just man is useful. He points out that justice can't be a thing of much use if it's only useful when applied to things that are not being used. At this point, Socrates takes over, having shown the flaws in Polemarchus's definition. He says, is not the man who is most skillful to strike or inflict a blow in a fight, whether as a boxer or elsewhere, also the most wary to guard against a blow? And is it also not true that he who best knows how to guard against diseases is also most cunning to communicate it and escape detection? Polemarchus agrees. So Socrates logically concludes that the person who's best at guarding money is also the person who knows how to steal it. So the just man has turned out to be a kind of thief, but one who steals for the benefits of his friends and the harm of his enemies. And Polemarchus replies, no, by Zeus, I no longer know what I mean, yet this I still believe, that justice benefits friends and harms enemies. So Socrates clearly got the better of Polemarchus, but how did he do it? Well, early on in the argument, he got Polemarchus to agree that justice is an art. But if justice is an art, then what's the object of that art? Because for all the examples Socrates gave, Polemarchus agreed that there was another artist more closely related to that art. So you'd want a horseman for horsemanship or a doctor for medicine, but then the question is, what is the object for justice? And this is what Polemarchus is struggling to find, because by defining justice as that which benefits friends and harms enemies, the question remains, how does justice benefit friends and harms enemies? So Socrates tries a new tact. He asks if by friends Polemarchus means those who appear to be good or those who actually are. He points out that sometimes people make mistakes about who their friends are, thinking someone to be a friend when that person is actually their enemy and deceiving them. So Socrates and Polemarchus agree that instead of saying justice is doing good to one's friends and harm to one's enemies, they say it is just to harm the unjust and benefit the just. We might call this the second and a half definition of justice in the Republic, but I hesitate to call it a full-fledged definition because it's not really defining justice. It's simply saying that the just thing to do is help good people and harm bad people. But Socrates presses on. He says, if horses are harmed, does that make them better or worse horses? Similarly, does harming a dog make it a better or worse dog? Finally, doesn't hurting a man make him worse with respect to being a man? And isn't justice the virtue particular to men? So doesn't hurting a man make him more unjust? Polemarchus agrees, and with this Socrates springs his next trap. If justice is to do good towards people and harming the unjust, and if by harming someone you make them more unjust, then it would seem that the art of justice would make men unjust. But does the art of music make men unmusical? Or the art of horsemanship make men worse at dealing with horses? Then how is it that justice can make men more unjust? So Socrates says it can't be justice to harm anyone, and Polemarchus concedes that point to Socrates. With this, the second part of the introductory dialogue has ended. Now, one thing I neglected to mention earlier, for the sake of time, is that Cephalus and Polemarchus especially were basing many of their arguments on quotes from revered Greek poets and orators, especially Homer. Throughout the discussion, Socrates doesn't usually attack these orators directly, but he does challenge the interpretation his interlocutors have of them. This is something relatively common for Socrates. Many of his dialogues begin with someone presenting the commonly accepted wisdom of his time, and Socrates asking questions to show his interlocutors how this commonly accepted wisdom may require some more nuance. It is this method of questioning that we now call the Socratic method. With Polemarchus defeated, the third challenger to Socrates enters in a dramatic fashion. Thrasymachus, even while we were conversing, has been trying several times to break in and lay hold of the discussion, but he was restrained by those who sat by him who wished to hear the argument out. But when we came to a pause after I had said this, he couldn't hold any longer his peace, but gathering himself up like a wild beast, he hurled himself upon us as if he would tear us to pieces. And Polemarchus and I were frightened and fluttered apart, and he bawled out into our midst. So already we can tell that Thrasymachus isn't going to be a cool, calm, and collected interlocutor. He demands that instead of asking questions and shifting definitions, Socrates be clear and direct as to what he thinks justice is. Socrates, being the cheeky guy he is, says that he is sorry to Thrasymachus and that it isn't a lack of will that makes him delay in defining justice, but a lack of ability, and he needs the guidance of a clever fellow like Thrasymachus. He also points out that Thrasymachus had forbidden certain answers to Socrates, so how could he possibly honestly answer his question? Thrasymachus then says, "Then if I show you another answer about justice differing from all these, a better one, what penalty do you think you deserve?" Socrates replies, "Why, what else than that which it befits anyone who is ignorant to suffer? It befits him, I presume, to learn from the one who does know. That, then, is what I propose I should suffer." So after Thrasymachus makes a big show of saying Socrates shouldn't just ask questions about other people's definitions of justice, but gives his own, Thrasymachus has just fallen into the same trap in trying to teach Socrates. But it gets even worse. Thrasymachus says, "I like your simplicity, but in addition to learning, you must pay a fine of money." Socrates says, "I will when I've got it." This is a bit of a joke because Socrates famously doesn't accept money. He's known to have had a wife and 3 children who came from a wealthy family, so presumably that's how they got by. But Socrates himself never accepted money, so it's a bit ridiculous for Thrasymachus to ask for it. This is probably meant to reinforce that Thrasymachus is one of the sophists, the philosophers who would go around teaching philosophy to the kids of rich families for payment. Anyway, Glaucon interjects saying that the group will pay for Socrates, which you gotta wonder how everyone else felt about that. Imagine you're hanging out with your friends and one of your drunk friends says to another, "Dude, I'll tell you what justice really is, but you gotta pay to hear me talk." That guy says, "Hey, I don't have any money." And then a third one says, "Oh, it's okay, we'll all pay for him." Wouldn't you be like, "Glaucon, no one asked you"? Anyway, Thrasymachus presents our third definition of justice, which is that justice is nothing else than the advantage of the stronger. Socrates then asks him what he means by this, and Thrasymachus responds that in states with a democratic government, the government enacts democratic laws, a tyranny enacts tyrannical laws, and an aristocratic government enacts aristocratic laws. Therefore, if justice is a matter of laws, it seems that justice is a matter of advantaging the stronger, since the more powerful will come to rule a state and will enact laws to advantage themselves. Having been given this definition, Socrates asks Thrasymachus whether obedience to one's ruler is just. Thrasymachus agrees that it is, and that's all it takes for Socrates to lay his trap. Socrates asks Thrasymachus if rulers are capable of making mistakes, and that sometimes when they try to make laws for their own advantage, they may screw up and actually make laws for their disadvantage. Thrasymachus agrees that of course that's possible. So Socrates points out, "It seems that what is to the stronger's disadvantage is also just. For if the ruler makes a mistake and passes a law that is to his disadvantage, then justice requires the citizens to follow it. This trap so elegantly sprung causes the rest of the group to try to parse out exactly how Socrates has executed it." Basically, the point Socrates is saying is, look, if rulers make laws for their own benefit, and it is just for people to obey those laws, then if the rulers are screwing up and making laws that are actually not for their own benefit, then the people, out of justice, are obeying laws that are to the disadvantage of the ruler. Therefore, justice also seems to be the disadvantage of the rulers. Socrates, being eminently fair, tries to come to Thrasymachus' defense and offers that Thrasymachus might have meant that justice is for the citizen to act for the advantage of the stronger, regardless of the laws the stronger passes. Thrasymachus, of course, rejects this help and instead tries to say if the ruler makes a mistake and passes a law that's to his disadvantage, then he's clearly not the stronger. The mental gymnastics Thrasymachus plays here are Olympics worthy. He makes an analogy to a craftsman and says we call a craftsman with respect to his knowledge about his craft. But if he makes a mistake, then clearly his knowledge has abandoned him, so he can no longer be called a craftsman. Similarly, a ruler is stronger, and it is just to obey him. But if he makes a mistake, then he's not the stronger anymore, and it's no longer just to obey him. So Thrasymachus has essentially moved the goalposts here. Socrates accepts this, though, and asks two questions. Is a doctor a collector of fees or a healer of the sick? And as the captain of a ship, Socrates would say pilot, in his role as captain, a sailor or a ruler of sailors. Thrasymachus answers that a doctor is a healer and a captain a ruler of sailors. Can you see what Socrates is doing? Socrates then points out that arts are perfect in themselves and in no need of further art to perfect it. That being the case, then the art of medicine doesn't seek the advantage of medicine, but that of the body. The art of captaining a ship isn't for the advantage of the captain, but for the sailors. And the art of horsemanship is for the benefit of horses, not the horsemen. If that is the case, and given that the practitioner of an art is stronger than the thing the art is being practiced on, which Thrasymachus agrees is true, then it seems to be the case that justice is actually the stronger seeking the advantage of the weaker. Boom! Socrates has led Thrasymachus into his own trap. What is Thrasymachus going to do? Well, he's going to get really salty really fast. Tell me, Socrates, have you got a nurse? I'm asking because she lets her little snotty run around driveling and doesn't wipe your face clean, though you need it badly if she can't get you to know the difference between a shepherd and the sheep. Thrasymachus is unhinged. First of all, he's abandoned his argument about the true or ideal ruler and is now coming back to talking about actual rulers. And he's arguing that rulers are like shepherds who care for the good of their animals only as sources of their own profit. He goes on to say that the unjust who are willing to cheat and steal to serve their own ends, and then lie so that their cheating and stealing aren't discovered, are always going to come out on top of the person who isn't going to do that. So they are going to be happier and rule over the people who won't. So justice is the action of the weaker people who end up serving the stronger for his benefit, while the actions of the tyrant are injustice, and he acts for his own benefit. Thrasymachus therefore says that he prefers injustice to justice. After finishing, Thrasymachus gets up to leave, but the company protests and gets him to stay and suffer through Socrates' investigation. So Socrates leads Thrasymachus along and begins by pointing out that what makes different kinds of art different is that they have different functions and different benefits. So even if a sailor benefits by getting healthier while at sea because the sea air is good for his health, we would not call sailing the art of medicine. Thrasymachus agrees. Similarly, Socrates argues, it would be wrong to call the art of earning a wage, which is what the shepherd does when he slaughters and sells his sheep, the art of shepherding. Therefore, it's not the art of shepherding that benefits the shepherd, but the art of wage earning. The art of shepherding is only for the benefit of the sheep. Now Socrates points out that the rulers of the city are given pay. So Socrates says it would seem that the art of holding office is not for them, but for the benefit of those over whom they rule. As Socrates says, each craft performs its own task and benefits that over which it is set, but unless pay is added, the craftsman receives no benefit. Therefore, Socrates argues, we have returned to the point that every type of art, including the art of justice, is for the benefit of the weaker, not the stronger. Socrates then says, it is for this reason that those who consent to rule must be paid, because no one would take on the troubles of the state out of self-interest. But then he says something interesting. He says payment is either money, honor, or a penalty if they refuse. He explains that good rulers wouldn't want to rule out of a desire for money because they don't want to be seen as hirelings or thieves, and they don't want to rule out of a desire for honor because they aren't covetous of honor. Therefore, they must be compelled to rule by some kind of penalty if they don't. And the penalty for the just man if he doesn't rule is that he will be ruled over by a worse man than him. Therefore, the just man considers taking political power only as a necessary evil, in order to prevent an unjust man from getting it. This is why Socrates says that the true ruler doesn't seek his own advantage, but that of the ruled. Having addressed this point, Socrates now pivots into the main point of the discussion. He says that Thrasymachus' assertion that the life of the unjust man is better than that of the just is a far more important matter. So Socrates asks Thrasymachus what he considers justice and injustice, and Thrasymachus replies that justice is a noble simplicity, whereas injustice is a goodness of judgment. He even calls injustice a virtue. He also clarifies that what he means is a complete injustice. So Thrasymachus isn't talking about pickpockets, he's talking about tyrants who are capable of conquering entire cities. So the new argument that's taken up is that the unjust man is a wise, practical man, while the just man is naive and a simpleton. So Socrates will have to show that it is more prudent to be just than to be unjust. He begins by asking whether the just man will seek to outdo another just man. Just as a note, the actual word Socrates used in Greek was pleonexia, which means something like having more than one's fair share, or taking advantage of. But for the sake of simplicity, let's just say outdo, even if it is a big deviation from the text. Anyway, will the just man try to outdo another just man? Obviously not. But will a just man try to outdo an unjust man? Socrates and Thrasymachus both think so, but Thrasymachus believes that the unjust man is too smart and the just man too unintelligent to actually outdo him. Next, Socrates asks about the unjust man. Will the unjust man try to outdo both the just and the unjust man? And Thrasymachus says yes. So Socrates says the just man tries to outdo the unjust, whereas the unjust tries to outdo both. And here is the first step of the next trap that Thrasymachus falls into. Socrates appears to follow with a non sequitur, and asks if Thrasymachus agrees that there are such things as musicians and non-musical men. Thrasymachus agrees. Socrates then asks whether in regards to music, which is more intelligent, the musical or the unmusical. Thrasymachus says that it is clearly the musical man. Then Socrates makes a brilliant move. He asks, do you think then that any musician in tuning a lyre would try to outdo another musician? Thrasymachus says no, but he would try to outdo a non-musical man. Thrasymachus agrees. Essentially, Socrates has gotten Thrasymachus to agree that an intelligent man doesn't try to outdo or take advantage of another intelligent man, but only of an unintelligent man. So the good and wise man only tries to outdo his opposite, whereas the unintelligent man will try to outdo both his like and his opposite. Socrates now closes the trap on Thrasymachus. And does not our unjust man Thrasymachus try to outdo both unlike and like? But the just man will not outdo his like, but only his unlike. Then the just man is like the wise and good, while the unjust is like the bad and the ignorant. He is also clear to point out that Thrasymachus didn't go along calmly with these arguments, but with much balking and reluctance, and prodigious sweating and blushing. In fact, Thrasymachus throws a tantrum and basically says that he isn't going to play ball in the discussion anymore. It's these kinds of details that make the Republic so much fun. Not only is the philosophical argument interesting, but the characters embody the arguments as well. Thrasymachus arguing that the tyrant is stronger and more intelligent because he cheats the just man, is now trying to cheat Socrates, who he can't beat honestly. Anyway, having been victorious in showing that injustice is not intelligent or wise, Socrates turns to show that injustice is not strong or potent. So Socrates begins by saying that a city may be unjust and try to enslave other cities. Thrasymachus agrees. So Socrates asks whether the power of one city to enslave another is from justice or injustice. This may sound like a dumb question from Socrates' perspective, but we have to be precise. He isn't asking whether it is just or unjust for one city to enslave another city. He is asking whether it is justice or injustice that gives them the power to enslave another city. Thrasymachus says it is injustice, but then Socrates asks, do you think that a city, an army, or bandits, or thieves, or any other group that attempts any action in common could accomplish anything if they were unjust to one another? Thrasymachus agrees that they couldn't, and now it becomes clear where Socrates is driving. He says, division is the outcome of injustice, but justice brings about unity. Therefore, injustice within a city would keep a city divided against itself, and make it impossible for one city to cooperate in order to enslave another. Therefore, even an unjust city must be just at least internally. He also goes on to say that this exists within the individual as well. The totally unjust individual is incapable of accomplishing anything because of inner faction and lack of self-agreement. Therefore, If a man is capable of an unjust action, it is only because there is a remnant of justice within him. This is an important point that will show up again very soon. Self-agreement and the capacity for action is caused by justice. So Socrates has shown that justice is not only wiser and more prudent than injustice, but it is also stronger. Having accomplished this, Socrates turns to what will become a central discussion and main ethical question of the Republic: whether the just man is happier than the unjust. Given what has gone before, it would seem like it is, but Socrates wants to make a stronger case. So he begins by saying that the work of a thing is that which one can do only with it or best with it. To explain this point, he asks, is it possible to see anything except with our eyes, or to hear anything except with our ears? Obviously, the answer is no. So Socrates argues that the proper work of the eyes is to see, and the proper virtue of the ears is to hear. Then he jumps farther and says that while it is possible to trim a vine with a variety of tools, a pruning knife is best suited for this purpose, and therefore, because it is best suited for that purpose, then the virtue of the pruning knife is to be a vine trimmer. Now, if everything has its own work, then it also follows that each thing has its own virtue or excellence. For example, if the work of the eyes is to see, then we might call the virtue or excellence of the eyes vision. So eyes require vision, the virtue associated with seeing in order to see. Eyes without vision are blind and can't see. So each thing has its own work and therefore its own virtue. So Socrates continues by saying that the soul has a work and virtue of its own: management, rule, deliberation, and the sustaining of life. Now, for any atheists who are getting triggered by the mention of a soul, don't worry. Soul doesn't mean what you think it means. Feel free to substitute it with a phrase like animating part of the body if you need to. Since the soul has its own work, it would seem that it too has its own virtue. If a person's soul lacks virtue, then it will manage its affairs badly. So what do we call the virtue of the soul? Well, do you remember when we said above that justice is that which causes unity and self-agreement in an individual? This is what Socrates presents as the virtue of the soul. So the just man will have a more capable soul than the unjust man, and therefore will have a better and happier life because he has a more virtuous soul. So it would seem that Socrates has accomplished what he has set out for. He has shown Thrasymachus' definition of justice is wrong. He has shown that justice is wiser and more prudent than injustice, and that it's stronger and more profitable. So let's review to see the different definitions of justice we have so far. First, Cephalus defined justice as telling the truth and paying back one's debts. Socrates finds problems with this definition because there appears to be some circumstances where paying back one's debts is not just. For example, giving your crazy friend their gun back when they ask it. Second, Polemarchus defined justice as doing good to one's friends and harming one's enemies, which was refined to doing good to good people and evil to evil people. But Socrates took issue with this definition because doing evil to a person would make them more unjust. But to say that the art of justice makes people unjust seems contradictory. Thus, this definition seems wrong. Third, Thrasymachus defined justice as the advantage of the stronger. Socrates found issue with this one because justice, in fact, seems to benefit the weaker. But except for telling us that justice is the virtue of the soul, Socrates still seems unsatisfied. The book closes with him having shown that it is better to be just than to be unjust, but with him complaining that he still doesn't know what justice is. Yes, it's the virtue of the soul, but how does the soul actually practice that virtue? This question of what justice really is will continue to be debated in the rest of the dialogue, but Book 2 will take a detour when one character will ask Socrates whether justice is desirable for itself or only for the things that come with it. Until next time, I'm Benedict the 17th. Go with God.